Welcome to Rescue Paws Stories, your go-to place for heartwarming and emotional humans and animals stories. The courthouse was unusually tense that morning. Rain tapped against the tall windows of the old building like nervous fingers, and even the gavel seemed reluctant to strike. Everyone present that day assumed the trial would be straightforward, another bitter custody battle between two broken people. But no one could have anticipated that a stray dog, of all things, would walk into the courtroom and change everything. Marla Jennings sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her fingers clenching a tissue that was already torn to shreds. Across the aisle sat her ex-husband, Jason, a former paramedic whose gaunt features and hollow eyes betrayed sleepless nights and too many regrets. Between them lay more than a custody case over their daughter, Hannah. There was grief, betrayal, and years of unspoken sorrow. What they hadn't known was that outside the courthouse, curled beneath the stone steps in the cold drizzle, lay a soaked and shivering German shepherd with a scar across his muzzle and eyes filled with stories no one had ever asked to hear. It wasn't until the second recess that the dog made his entrance. A loud bark echoed through the marble halls, followed by startled gasps. The courtroom doors swung open as if guided by fate, and in walked the shepherd, mud-caked, drenched, and regal, despite his ragged condition. Security rushed forward, but something about the dog made everyone freeze. He didn't growl, he didn't run. He walked down the center aisle with purpose and sat squarely between Marla and Jason. There was stunned silence. The judge, a stern but fair woman named Diane Keating, removed her glasses and blinked. "Is this dog part of either party's evidence?" Jason stood slowly, confused and shaky. "No, Your Honor. I've never seen him before." Marla shook her head as well, but her voice was soft, disarmed. "Me neither." The dog looked up at both of them, eyes wise and tired, and placed one paw on the bench between them. Then, without warning, he let out the softest, most mournful whimper anyone had ever heard, like a cry pulled from the bottom of a soul. The courtroom sat frozen. Something unexplainable passed through the air, a kind of collective breathlessness, as if the dog had opened a hidden door in the room that led straight to truth. Judge Keating narrowed her eyes, leaning forward. "Well, perhaps we're dealing with more than legal arguments today. Bailiff, let the dog stay." For now. Jason and Marla exchanged a glance, for the first time in weeks. Neither spoke, but something between them shifted, a flicker of something long buried. The dog curled up on the floor as if he'd known them forever. And the trial continued, under the watchful gaze of a silent stranger who wasn't finished changing lives. The rest of the day's proceedings played out under an invisible tension, one not caused by legal arguments or objections, but by the quiet presence of the dog who had inexplicably become the room's moral center. No one dared to remove him. Every time a raised voice cracked the air, the dog would lift his head, eyes heavy with a sorrow that seemed to hush even the most irate attorney. Even Judge Keating, who had been known for her no-nonsense demeanor, seemed gentler, more contemplative as she watched the unlikely courtroom guest. At lunch, Marla stepped outside for air, clutching her coat against the drizzle. She stood near the courthouse steps, watching as the rain pooled around the base of the columns. That's when the dog came out behind her. No leash, no command. Just presence. He sat beside her, quietly, his fur slick from the dampness. She didn't speak at first. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "Why are you here? Why now?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but he leaned his body gently against her leg, grounding her in a way no words ever could. Inside the building, Jason sat alone, head in hands. The trial had begun to dig deeper into their lives, into the screaming fights, the painful silences after Hannah's death. They weren't fighting over custody anymore. They were fighting over ghosts, regrets, guilt. And yet that dog kept looking at him like he already knew his pain. Later that afternoon, something unexpected happened. As the judge asked for closing statements, the dog stood and walked toward Jason, slowly, deliberately. The courtroom held its breath. Jason turned his chair, startled as the shepherd placed a paw on his knee and stared up into his eyes. Jason broke. Tears spilled down his cheeks as his voice cracked. "We lost our daughter in that fire, and I couldn't get to her in time. I tried, but she was already gone." The room went utterly still. He looked across the aisle. "I blamed you, and I know you blamed me, but it wasn't your fault. It wasn't mine either. It was just cruel." Marla's face crumpled. For the first time in months, she saw not the man who walked away, but the man who had once cradled their infant daughter with shaking hands and a heart full of love. Judge Keating cleared her throat, blinking quickly. "It appears the court will take a recess before rendering judgment." That night, Marla and Jason didn't go home angry. They didn't even go separately. They sat in the courthouse lobby on a bench, silently watching the dog sleep, curled at their feet, like a guardian angel made of scars and silence. And though they didn't know it yet, everything had already changed. The courtroom was quieter the next day, not in volume, but in energy. Something had shifted. The bailiff no longer glanced nervously at the stray German shepherd. The attorneys, normally hardened and efficient, spoke with less venom. Even the judge's robe seemed to weigh lighter on her shoulders. But the change ran deeper than mood. It lived in the silence between Jason and Marla, who now sat beside each other instead of across a chasm of pain. Word had spread. Reporters with cameras stood outside the courthouse, curious about the courtroom dog. Volunteers from the shelter had come, hoping to claim him. But every time someone reached out with a leash, the dog quietly backed away, until Marla or Jason spoke. He responded only to their voices, like a soul recognizing something once lost. But the biggest surprise came when the dog did something no one expected. During testimony from a witness who had long claimed to be a close friend of Jason's, the man began speaking ill of Marla, calling her unstable, unfit. Jason didn't speak, but the dog stood. He walked slowly down the aisle, and then, with calm precision, he sat in front of the witness stand and stared at the man with unnerving focus. The man's voice faltered. He stammered. Then he stopped talking entirely. Judge Keating leaned forward. "Is there something wrong, Mr. Collins?" The man shook his head, suddenly pale. "No, Your Honor. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be here. I don't have the right to say these things." And with that, he stepped down. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the clerk looked stunned. Outside, between sessions, Jason sat on the courthouse steps with the dog beside him. He gently rubbed behind the shepherd's ear and asked quietly, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" That's when a voice spoke behind him. "I think I know," said a woman in her 40s, wrapped in a yellow raincoat and holding an old photo in her hand. She stepped forward and showed Jason the picture. It was a little girl, around 8 years old, smiling with missing front teeth and hugging a familiar German shepherd with the same scar on his muzzle. "That's my niece Kayla," the woman said. She and her dog, Rust, disappeared 2 years ago in a bad part of town. Kayla was found, but Rust ran. No one ever saw him again. Jason looked from the photo to the dog. The same eyes, the same solemn posture. This is him. The woman's eyes brimmed with tears. He saved Kayla from a break-in, got stabbed trying to protect her. Then he vanished. We always wondered what happened to him. Jason felt something inside his chest collapse and rebuild all at once. He's been carrying something all this time, the woman nodded. Pain, memory, but also purpose. Inside the courthouse, Marla was waiting. When Jason walked back in with Rust at his side, something unspoken passed between them again. The dog hadn't just walked into their trial. He had brought a trial of his own, a test of truth, of forgiveness, of healing, and they were beginning to understand that they weren't on opposite sides anymore. As the next morning's sun filtered through the courthouse windows, there was an unspoken reverence in the air. The dog, Rust, as he was now known, had become more than a presence. He was now part of the trial, not as a witness, but as a force of truth no one could ignore. His silent, unwavering gaze carried more weight than any spoken testimony. Judge Keating, visibly affected by the events of the previous day, addressed the courtroom before proceedings began. This is an unusual case, not just because of the circumstances, but because something larger than law has entered this room. I ask everyone to proceed today with respect, for the court, for each other, and for the truth. Marla took the stand again. This time she wasn't shaking. Her voice was steadier. I didn't leave Jason because I stopped loving him, she said, eyes flicking to him. I left because I couldn't watch him become someone else. After the accident, he buried everything. Our son, his pain, me. Jason sat silently, hands clasped, Rust's head resting gently on his knee. I begged him to go to therapy, to talk, to let someone in. But he just shut the world out. I thought maybe, if I left, it would shake him awake. Marla's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. But I never stopped believing he was still in there. The man I loved. A hush fell. Even the opposing attorney lowered her pen, no longer scribbling objections. Then came Jason's turn. He didn't rise. Instead, he looked at the judge and asked, "May I speak from here?" Judge Keating nodded. Jason leaned forward, eyes fixed on Marla. The night of the accident, when we lost Evan, something inside me died, and I thought if I didn't talk about it, if I just worked, just existed, maybe I wouldn't feel the pain anymore. But that pain became my life. He paused, his voice raw. And when you left, I hated you. Not because you stopped loving me, but because you were brave enough to feel, brave enough to walk away instead of drowning like I did. Marla's hand went to her mouth, trembling. Jason looked down at Rust, who lifted his head as if waiting. Then this dog, this stray, walked into our lives and did what I couldn't. He forced me to look again, to see you, to see myself. He brought our pain into the light. Everyone was quiet. Even the court reporter, cheeks glistening, didn't move. Rust stood and walked slowly to the center of the room. Then he turned back, facing both Marla and Jason, sitting between them, silent, still, like a bridge built from sorrow and second chances. And then, softly, Marla rose from the witness stand. She didn't speak. She simply walked across the courtroom, knelt beside Rust, and held out her hand. Jason reached for it. Their fingers touched, tentatively, then fully, as if they were remembering something lost but never truly gone. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom, but Judge Keating said nothing. She let the moment hold, because sometimes the greatest testimony isn't spoken, it's felt. And in that room, a dog no one invited had just closed the gap between two broken hearts, with nothing but presence, loyalty, and love. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered. Reporters, curious townsfolk, even children leaning against their parents' legs, all drawn by the incredible rumors. A stray dog had somehow stopped a divorce and healed a shattered family. But inside the courtroom, the air remained sacred. Something had shifted, not just in the lives of Marla and Jason, but in everyone watching. What had begun as a legal battle was becoming a profound human story. Judge Keating leaned forward, folding her hands. This court was not asked to rule on custody of a child or division of estates. You came here to decide whether this marriage still stood a chance. But I believe the truth walked into this courtroom, on 4 legs. She let that hang, her eyes drifting to Rust, who now sat beside Marla and Jason like a quiet witness to their pain and reconciliation. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, the judge continued gently, do you still wish to proceed with this divorce? Jason and Marla glanced at each other. The silence was thick, not with uncertainty, but with meaning. And then Marla slowly stood. Your Honor, no, I don't think we do. Jason followed suit. We want to try, not for the sake of appearances, not even because of the past, but because something in us still believes. And because of him. He nodded to Rust. A soft, collective gasp whispered through the courtroom, like a sigh of relief from everyone present. Then this case is dismissed, said Judge Keating, her voice warm, on the condition that you both seek counseling, and, she smiled slightly, you take very good care of that remarkable dog. Applause erupted, not loud or celebratory, but reverent, the kind of applause meant not just for a happy ending, but for the courage it takes to begin again. Reporters rushed forward when the couple stepped outside, their hands entwined, Rust trotting proudly beside them like a 4-legged angel of redemption. Cameras clicked and questions flew. What's the dog's name? How did he bring you back together? What happens now? Marla glanced down at Rust, who looked up at her with amber eyes full of calm. We named him Rust, she said softly, because like old metal, sometimes love looks worn and forgotten, but it still holds everything together. Jason chuckled, his voice breaking slightly. We lost our son, but in the most impossible way, this dog brought us back to each other. He showed us there's still life after the storm. That night, in a modest house lit by soft lamplight, Marla and Jason sat together on the porch, their shoulders touching, the pain not erased but shared at last. Rust lay at their feet, his ears twitching gently in the wind, as if listening for more lives that might need mending. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Words had done enough. Instead, they simply sat, grieving, healing, hoping, and the stars above them burned quietly, like reminders of all that had been lost and all that could still be found. Months passed, and the story of the courtroom dog spread far beyond the small town. Newspapers ran headlines like "Stray Dog Saves Marriage in Courtroom Twist" and "Rust the Miracle Dog, a Tale of Redemption." But for Marla and Jason Holloway, the real miracle was quieter, rooted in the slow, painful work of rebuilding trust, brick by brick, day by day. Rust was at the heart of it all, as steady and loyal as the rhythm of the seasons. Every morning, Marla would open the blinds and find Rust already watching the world from the porch, as though guarding their new beginning. Jason started waking early too, brewing coffee and taking Rust on long walks through the woods behind their home. On those walks, he talked to the dog like an old friend, often pausing to gather his thoughts, his emotions, sometimes even his tears. The grief of losing their son never left, but it became something they shared rather than suffered alone. Some evenings, they'd sit together with a candle lit beneath a framed photo of Leo, their boy with the bright laugh and eyes too wise for his years. Rust would always lie quietly beside them, sometimes resting his chin on Jason's foot, as if grounding him back into the present. One weekend, Marla and Jason attended a community event where families gathered to honor lost loved ones. There, they shared their story, not just about their son or their marriage, but about the day a stray dog walked into a courtroom and interrupted fate. After they spoke, several people came up to them, grieving mothers, divorced fathers, even a local judge. One woman placed her hand on Marla's and whispered, "I was going to sign my papers this week, but now I think I need to take another look." Another man told Jason that he'd spent years estranged from his teenage daughter after a tragic loss, but hearing about Rust gave him the courage to reach out again. "If a dog can teach a couple to feel again," he said with a tearful laugh, "maybe I can do the same with my own kid." Inspired by Rust's story, the community rallied to build a small memorial garden beside the courthouse. Leo's Garden, they called it, named after the Holloway's son, but also symbolizing second chances. At the center of the garden stood a life-sized statue of a dog, ears perked, eyes hopeful. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "Rust. He reminded us that even broken hearts can find their way home." Rust's fame continued to grow, but he never seemed to care. He was still the same gentle soul, chasing butterflies in the yard, sleeping with his head on Marla's lap, and offering silent comfort in moments no words could reach. Years later, when Rust's own time came, he passed peacefully on a sunlit morning, curled between the people he had brought back from the edge. Marla and Jason buried him under the tree where Leo used to climb, wrapping him in the same blanket that once warmed their son. It was a goodbye, wrapped in gratitude and tears. And yet, Rust's presence never left. His story echoed through courtrooms, counseling offices, and dinner tables across the country. Families facing their own fractures would often say, "Remember Rust," as a kind of compass, a reminder of what could still be saved. In the end, Rust wasn't just a stray dog who interrupted a courtroom. He was a messenger, a humble, tail-wagging guardian of what matters most: love, forgiveness, family, and the courage to begin again.